What's up, Wizards? It's Dev and the Z-Man. We're from Mtg. We like that magic stuff. And in the next couple of days, we're rounding the corner on Zendikar Rising spoilers. We're going to be finishing this thing off tomorrow afternoon. But for today, I finally get to show off my exclusive preview for Zendikar Rising. Now in this video, we are going to be talking about all the stuff that came out today, plus a few things that came out over the weekend. I streamed those spoilers on Twitch, but it's pretty likely that you missed those. So I'm going to be talking about a few things from the weekend, but I want to go ahead and show you Scavenger Blade. The Scavenger Blade costs 2 mana, 1 and a red. It's an equipment that attaches to a creature that you control when it ETBs. It gives the creature +2/+0, and you can re-equip it for 2 and a red. Now, the closest comparison I could come up with here is Bone Splitter, but that's a pretty good comparison. It's nowhere near as good as Bone Splitter, but I do think it's worth pointing out that it costs just as much to cast and equip a Bone Splitter as it does to cast and equip this. Now, Splitter's been pretty decent in the past, so I don't just want to immediately write this card off, especially considering that we have Fervent Champion in Standard. This goes really well on first strike creatures, and it's always going to equip to a Fervent Champion for free, and that might matter a great deal. So I like that idea, but there's also the Nihiris deck, and if you're going to build the Nihiris deck, you're probably going to want a fair number of relatively strong equipments, and this is at least that. If you're building a Nihiris deck, this almost certainly gets a 4 slot. Let's not forget about Limited, where the card looks pretty decent to me too, right? You get a permanent +2/+0 bonus on your side of the table. And that's going to let even your small dudes trade with 4 and 5 drop creatures. So I do like the card there, and I actually think it might have some legs in Standard, given the right strategies being prolific. So again, don't want to write the card off immediately. I think it could actually provide some labor for us in the upcoming format. As always, thanks to Wizards for the exclusive free preview. Hope I get another one next season. I like this card a good bit. But let's go ahead and move on to some of the other stuff that we saw from this morning. Well, let's start things off today with Moss Pit Skeleton. 2 mana, a green and a black for a 2/2 plant skeleton with kicker 3. If it was kicked, it enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on a creature you control, if skeleton is in your graveyard, you may put it on top of your library. I really hate that it's on top of your library. I wish it was in your hand or onto the battlefield. Would have been obviously really good, but on top of your library kind of sucks. Replacing your next draw is something I don't usually love, so I'm not a big fan, all things considered. I don't think that it's good enough for competitive, but if you get multiple copies of it in draft, then maybe that's pretty decent. I mean, it's a recurable creature, so it's always going to be decent in a limited environment. And I like that it's kind of on curve, right? It's a 2 mana 2/2, and if you kick it, it's a 5 mana 5/5. And both of those are decent stat lines in limited. But again, I'm not really sure how good this is going to be in competitive Standard. You know, obviously, multiples are decent, because if there's one on your yard and you play another one, then suddenly you put the counters on that one if you kicked it, and any copies that are in your yard go to the top of your library. It seems good, but I'm not sure that with it going to the top rather than into your hand or into play, that this is really good enough. So I'm going to move on to Drana's Silencer. 6 mana, 3/2 Vampire Rogue. When Drana's Silencer enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls gets -X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures in your party. So one of their guys always gets at least -1/-1, but as soon as you can make this -2/-2, I think it's probably good enough in your limited deck, and I do like that it's common. It costs a little bit too much mana, so I'm not looking at putting too many copies of this into my deck, but in the party deck, this is a pretty decent 6-drop. I do not like the stats. A 3/2 is abysmal for 6 mana, but at the same time, if it does kill a creature when it comes into play, it's almost always going to be worth playing. So let's move on to Journey to Oblivion. This is 4 and a white for an enchantment that costs 1 less to cast for each creature in your party. When Journey to Oblivion enters the battlefield, you Oblivion Ring a thing. Exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until Journey to Oblivion leaves the battlefield. So first of all, this, like a couple of other cards in the set, it has the Fiend Hunter wording, meaning that if you can somehow get rid of or do something about Journey to Oblivion while this ability is on the stack, right? If you can just disenchant your own Journey to Oblivion while its ability is on the stack after it comes into play, then the creature will never come back, or whatever you exile will never come back. Interesting wording that they're using this again. I think it's always been a cool wrinkle in sort of the design, so I kind of like that, but at the same time, I think this is also pretty playable in limited, right? This is just removal, and removal is always playable in limited, but even if we do have a party deck in Standard, I'm not sure how much it wants to play this. It can cost just 1 mana for an O-Ring, and that's probably worth playing on its own, but as I've stated before, I kind of like the creatures that work off the party mechanic because they almost always ensure that you get at least one proc towards party because they have that creature type. Stuff that's not a creature but works off of party, I'm a little bit more ambivalent about. I'm a little bit more wary of because it doesn't actually contribute to the party stat on its own. So, right, if you have after a raft, this is just a 5-mana Oblivion ring, that's terrible. So, I'm a little bit wary of it, but at the same time, I think it's a fantastic limited card. We'll move on to Wayward Guide Beast. This is just 1 red mana for a 2/2 beast with trample and haste. And when it deals combat damage to a player, you return a land you control to its owner's hand. So if you have stuff that lets you put out multiple lands a turn, this isn't so much of a big deal. But I guess if you play this on turn 1, swing with it on turn 2, and deal combat damage, it's not as good. It's nowhere near as good. You could always play your second land in your main phase and play your 2-drop and then swing with this. End up returning a land to your hand. And then it doesn't feel so bad, especially if your curve is very low. If your curve stops at 2 or whatever. This is never going to hinder you that much, but I still, I'm not sure. I think this might actually be better in older formats like Modern that have the ability to play with such a low curve. Right? We have stuff like Lyris of the Dream Den that rewards playing with a low curve in Standard, but especially with such a small card pool, I'm not sure you're going to be able to play with, where your curve stops at 2. But you might be able to play with this card and your curve stops at 3. It's entirely possible. It won't always deal combat damage. Although if your opponent blocks it with like a 1 power or 1 toughness guy, it still tramples over. It's really bad if you play this on turn 1, by the way, and swing with it and go ahead and, return the land to your hand. Then your curve has to be basically all 1s, and that's not good. But late in the game, I guess it's fine. I mean, it's a 2-power attacker. If you just got Wrathed or something, you won't mind playing this on turn 5 and returning a land to your hand when it does combat damage, because at that point you probably have more than enough lands. So this is a really interesting design space right here, but I'm not quite sure how good it actually is. That said, it might be unbelievable. A card like this, a 1-mana 2/2 trample haste, that might be insane. So I'll let time figure out if that's a decent card. Again, I think it's probably better the farther you go back in formats. But moving on, let's get to Nihiris Lithoforming. This is 2 red and X for a sorcery. Sacrifice X lands. For each land sacrificed this way, draw a card. You may play X additional lands this turn. Lands you control enter the battlefield tapped this turn. So this obviously has the ability to be crazy. If you want to sacrifice, 5 lands or something like that, you do have to pay like 7 mana for that. But if you sacrifice like 5 lands, you're going to draw 5. You're still going to be able to play like 1 or 2 lands from that. So you might not be losing too much. But at the same time, I think there's like way too many hoops to jump through. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's a very specific deck that, somehow leverages this. But I'm not quite seeing it. I guess if you were super desperate, you could go X equals 2 for 4 mana somewhat in the mid game. And sacrifice a couple of lands to draw a couple of cards. But I still, I'm not like super sold that this is going to be good at almost any point in the game, because it won't like finish the game. You're sacrificing a bunch of lands to draw a bunch of cards. And that's kind of the thing that would normally be up my alley, because I hate having a ton of lands. I hate flooding. And this is at least a flood mitigator, but I'm just not sure that a flood mitigator like this is worth the slot in your deck, especially considering that as soon as you sack all those lands and you draw like 4 cards, you're going to want those lands to cast the stuff that you drew. So, I don't know. I'm not quite sold on this yet, but again, I wouldn't be surprised if there was some sort of unbelievable application for this, but we'll see. Moving on, here's Canyon Gerboa. I love the art, but that's about it. This is 3 mana, 2 and a white for a 1/2 mouse. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. So, again, I think in Limited there's a green-red landfall deck, but there's also a green-white landfall deck, right? We've seen that thing, the 4 mana 4/4, Yasharn, I think it is, that goes and gets 2 lands when it enters the battlefield. And then there's also Fledgling, the 2 mana 1/1 that gets a counter and flying whenever you play a land. So there's obviously an argument for like green-white landfall in Limited as well, and this is going to be really good in that deck. Obviously, the stats for 3 mana aren't very good, and anytime it's not your turn, the creature's going to be awful. But at the same time, if you can play 2 lands in 1 turn, or even 3 lands in 1 turn, there are ways to do that in this Limited environment, at the uncommon level, actually, then giving all your creatures +3/+3 for playing lands is pretty ridiculous. Giving all your creatures +2/+2 for playing a couple of lands in turn is ridiculous. So I could actually see this being the backbone of a pretty interesting Limited deck, but I'm still not sure that the green-red deck isn't just better. I think the green-red deck in Limited has a lot more fast power, and maybe that's more constructed level playability. But maybe the green-white deck has a little bit more long game power, and that kind of, building your creatures up, building a board state over the course of the game is probably better for Limited. So maybe the green-white deck is the better Limited deck. But, well, again, we'll have to wait and see. I'm not too sure about any of those words. But moving on, here's Molten Blast. 2 and a red for an instant. Choose 1. Blast deals 2 damage to a creature or planeswalker, or you destroy target artifacts. So a Braid got way worse. A Braid got so much worse. I guess a Braid can deal damage to planeswalkers now, but 2 to a planeswalker isn't going to be great a lot of the time, let's face it. So, you might pick off the last couple of damage after an attack, and that'll be okay, but I really don't think that, trading a damage and, adding an extra 1 to the mana cost makes this... Here's my take. I'm pretty sure that it succeeds in making a Braid unplayable. I think is what I'm trying to get at here. If there are important artifacts in the format, then maybe this sees some amount of play because it's somewhat main deckable, but I don't know. I wouldn't hold my breath. I would have just liked to see a Braid back. But let's move on to Forsaken Monument. 5 mana for a legendary artifact. It's mythic. Colorless creatures you control get +2/+2. Whenever you tap a permanent for colorless, add an additional colorless. Whenever you cast a colorless spell, you gain 2 life. So I like it. I love this. I love it so much. I think it's really cool in Commander, first of all, so there's that. I haven't really talked much about Commander yet this season, but a lot of these cards are actually slam dunks for Commander, and this is right up there with the best of them, if we want to talk about EDH. But I want to at least try to make it work in Standard, because I try to make a colorless deck work in Standard like every season. We've got Ugin the Spirit Dragon, we've got Solemn Simulacrum and stuff. Like, we can make this work, everybody. We've got the 3-mana Mirror that taps for colorless, which means that it now taps for, 3 colorless, so that's good. It's not bad at all, right? If you go Myrrh into this, you can probably then go Ugin on the next turn. So that's turn 5 Ugin. Could be worse. But altogether, I do love this card quite a bit. I think all the different bonuses it infers are definitely worth trying to make a colorless deck work. And in terms of cards that colorless decks want, I think this is probably even better than Mystic Forge, which is rotating, but just wanted to make that point. If you want to pay off for colorless, I think this is a million times better than Forge. So I'm really glad to have this in Standard, and I really want to try to make something happen with this. We've got plenty of colorless lands that survive rotations, so, once you get this out, you're just ramping like crazy. You could almost look at this like a Nissa. If you wanted to. If you had enough colorless stuff that taps for mana, this is almost a Nissa. If you have enough, mobilized districts, that rotates. But you know what I mean. Any land that taps for colorless, this is going to be beautiful with. So I do like this card a good bit, and I want it to work, and it just might. Let's move on to Akiri, Fearless Voyager. This is 3 mana, 1 a red and a white for a 3/3 legendary core warrior. It's the lady from the trailer. Whenever you attack a player with 1 or more equipped creatures, you draw a card. And if you pay white, you may unattach an equipment from a creature you control. If you do, tap that creature, and it gains indestructible till end of turn. So an interesting little combat trick to have if your opponent surprises you with something. You can always just pay 1 mana and effectively protect that creature. It's really interesting. This can also screw up your opponent's blocks in some ways. So for just 1 white mana, that might be kind of a sneaky little ability there that is better than it reads on paper. But being able to draw a card whenever you swing with an equipped dude is ridiculous. That's actually quite good, and it really makes these other equipments, for instance, like Scavenger Blade, much more palatable, and this goes directly into Nihiri on curve, so that's probably worth mentioning as well. Just interesting little card here that I'm not actually sure quite makes it in terms of Standard playability, but it will at least be really fun to test with. Moving on, though, let's look at Lithiform Engine. This is 4 mana for a legendary artifact. It is mythic, and it's probably going to be the Commander staple from this set. This is 2 tap. Copy target activated or triggered ability you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. Sweet. Rings of Brighthearth or whatever. You can also pay 3 and tap. To copy target instant or sorcery spell you control, you may choose new targets for the copy. Sweet. So you get a little Isochron Scepter thing sort of going on there. And you can also pay 4 and tap to copy target permanent spell you control. So woof, like, it just does everything. The card is unbelievable in Commander. I don't think this is great in Standard, but it might be if we get the correct activated abilities, none of which I can think of at the time. Right now, but it's always going to be like a 4-mana do nothing artifact the turn you play it in Standard, so I'm just not sure like how great that is. If you do have enough mana to pump into it, maybe you got like a Chromatic Orrery and you have all the mana in the world, then suddenly you can play it and use its ability in the same turn, but very often that's going to require even more mana because you have to have an activated ability. You have to have an instant or sorcery or permanent spell you want to cast. So it's going to take a lot of mana to use this the same turn it comes out, but it's feasible at the very least. But all I'm saying is that Commander, this is probably the card for Commander players in this set. But I do want your opinion. I haven't played Commander since the world went crazy, so it's been a few months, and I didn't play as much Commander as I'd like to. Even back in the day when I did play Commander. So Commander players in the comments, sound off on this. Is this as bonkers as I think it is? Because I think this might be like one of the best Commander cards we've seen in like the last 5 sets. But let me know. Slap me down if I'm wrong. Moving on, let's look at Skyclave Relic. This is 3... Actually, let's go back a second. I think Lithiform Engine specifically might be the best Commander card since Helm of the Host. I'm going to let that sit there. All right, let's move on. The Skyclave Relic. This is 3 mana for an artifact with kicker 3, and it has indestructible. When Relic enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, create 2 tapped tokens that are copies of Relic, and you can tap it for a mana of any color. So that's cool. I'm not sure how good it is, but it's cool. I don't know if I want to pay 6 mana. It sucks that they come into play tap too. That's so lame. The copies come into play tap. If you do pay the 6, you're only really effectively playing 5 because you can tap Relic itself. But you can't tap the copies. And of course, just like every other 3-mana artifact that taps your mana, every rock, you're effectively only paying 2 for this, but you have to have 3 to begin with. I don't hate it. Let me put it. I don't hate this card. I also don't love this card. I do love that it's not legendary. It has to not be legendary for it to actually work. But copying this might be kind of interesting, but at the same time, it's just a rock. It's just a 3-mana rock. That's all it really is at the end of the day, so I can't get too excited about it. Let's move on to Inscription of Insight. This is 4 mana, 3 and a red for a sorcery with kicker 4, 2 and 2 blue. Choose 1. If this spell was kicked, choose any number instead. Return up to 2 target creatures to their owner's hands. Scry 2, then draw 2 cards. Target player creates an XX blue illusion creature token where X is the number of cards in their hand. So you do things by, the order that they're listed on the card. So if you do get all of these modes, you'll draw the 2 and then create the illusion. And that's something, I guess. But I want to say this card is bad, you guys. 4 mana isn't really great for any of the effects on this card, at sorcery speed especially. I will say that if you have enough cards in your hand, 4 mana to make like a 6/6 is probably okay. 4 mana for a 5/5 is probably okay. If you pay 4 mana for this and you get the sort of Foresight mode on it, or is it 4C? The Scry 2, then draw 2 cards. I guess you could be doing worse, but I really hate that's sorcery speed. The first mode, again, return 2 creatures to their owner's hands for 4 mana at sorcery speed, isn't actually terrible, but it's also not very good, right? It's just not amazing. I think that even though we're talking about blue decks here, I still think that the most attractive mode on this card is the last mode if you're just casting it for 4 mana. If you're casting it for 8 mana, you just cast an Ugin or something. I don't know. You won't always have access to Ugin. And obviously decks that want to play Ugin also want other stuff to spend 8 mana on turns where they're not playing Ugin, or they haven't drawn it yet. So maybe it has a chance. I do think that it absolutely wrecks everything if you are able to get all the modes on this. But I'm not sure that it's worth 8 mana. I can't be sure about this one, y'all. I really want to like this card, but I expected the blue one to be unbelievable. And it's believable. It's a believable card. But anyway, let's move on to Nihiris Binding. This is 1 and 2 white for an enchantment. It's an aura that enchants a creature or a planeswalker. And the enchanted permanent can attack or block. Its activated abilities can't be activated. Yay, it's one of these. You'll see a lot of play in limited. It's common, yeah. So common level removal that'll probably see, again, tons and tons of limited play. But moving on to Kadandu Stomper is 6 mana, a 5 and a green for a 6/5 beast with trample. And when an ETBs, return up to 2 lands you control to their owner's hands. So honestly, yeah, it goes in landfall decks. It's probably like the very, very top end of a landfall deck. You don't want more than one copy of this. But the trample is really good on your 6-power dude. That seems fantastic to me. If you have any kind of ramp in your deck, and the landfall deck probably does play a couple of rampy cards, then play this a little bit, ahead of schedule, and it seems like a pretty solid beater in the end game. So I do like it. And by the way, once you have 6 mana, you can pretty safely return 2 lands to your hand and still cast stuff on subsequent turns. So I actually think this is probably, at the very least, decent. But we'll move on. In limited, not outside of that. But anyway, we'll move on to Ondu Inversion and Ondu Sky Ruins. Inversion is 8 mana, 6 and 2 white. How much mana do they expect us to have in this format? It's 8 mana for a sorcery, destroy all non-land permanents. Or it's just a land that comes into play tapped and adds white. This is almost certainly going to see play. 100%. If you got the blue-white control decks that don't really have to play permanents anymore, right? We saw a lot of tap-out blue-white control because they played Teferi, they played Narset, they played Elspeth Conquers Death, which is probably still the card they want to tap out for most next to Shatter the Sky. So there are still some tap-out elements to that deck, but at the same time, you really don't have to play anywhere near as many permanents in that deck as you used to, because you don't have as many prominent planeswalkers as you once had. So I think a card like this, a Planar Cleansing knockoff, could definitely see play, especially considering it's a land too. You got to hit your drops. You play it as a land in the early game. If you need that second white source to get to Shatter the Sky, right, you play this on turn 3 or whatever. But if it's late in the game and you rip this off the top, you'll be incredibly happy as the control player that you rip this off the top of your library. You can blow away their Ugin and anything else nasty they have on the table. So I think this is destined to see at least one of play in pretty much every control deck in many formats, actually, not just standard. I mean, there's going to be a lot of formats where, again, this is just a good card, right? It mitigates, again, just like a lot of these cards, it mitigates the downside to being a land, right? In that you can actually do something with it if you draw it in the late game. But it also mitigates the downsides to being an 8-mana sorcery, because it's also a card you can just play any time in the game, on any turn, right? So it's not stuck in your hand for the entire game. I love this, specifically this design when the lands do this. And so this is destined to see play in maybe multiple formats, but at least standard and historic. But moving on, here's Squad Commander. This actually looks a little bit better than I thought at first glance. This is 4 mana, 3 and a white for a 3/3 core warrior. And when it ETBs, you create a 1/1 white core warrior creature token for each creature in your party. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you have a full party, creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain indestructible until end of turn. I actually think this is standard playable. 4 mana is a lot, but also note that this can proc the turn it enters the battlefield. This can do 2 things the turn it ETBs without ever actually having to attack or do anything else. Whether you play it on turn 4, and if you do play it on turn 4, you likely won't have a very full party, but you might still make a couple of 1/1s, at which case you're probably paying 4 mana for 5 power on 3 guys, and that's a really, really good rate. And if you get any more than that, it's a fantastic rate too. But if you do have a full party when you play it, let's say you top deck it on turn 6, you already have a full party. You play it, you get, 4 1/1s, and that's amazing, right? You're getting 7 power for 4 mana. And then when you go to attack that turn, all your party members that are attacking are getting this huge bonus. So and they're getting indestructible too, so you just get this consequence-free attack step. I actually think this is one of the most dangerous cards. If we're trying to make the party deck competitive, I think this is right up there in the best cards for the archetype. Even if you don't assemble a full party, and I think a lot of people are going to be like, dude, you have to have a full party to get that effect, and that's the best part of the card. Yeah, absolutely. And you won't always have a full party, but this will always create at least 1 warrior token for you. And it's very likely going to create, on turn 4, is very likely going to create 2 or 3 tokens for you, in which case you paid a really good rate for a lot of power on a lot of bodies. It's even decent after a Wrath, because at least you get 2 bodies fresh off of a Wrath, and that's really not bad, y'all. You won't always have a full party, I know that, but when you do, this probably confers one of the best bonuses to having a full party that we've seen so far, if not the best. So I actually really, really like this card. I've been really critical of the party mechanics so far, but of all the cards we've seen for that mechanic, I think this is easily one of the best. And honestly, I'd watch out for this in Standard. I'm serious. But moving on, I want to touch on some of the cards from over the weekend that you may not have heard me talk about because I talked about these cards on Twitch. And we did have a fair viewership on Twitch, but I know that not all of you saw this. So I want to quickly bring up Leyline Tyrant to begin with. Yes, this card is nuts to me. Not everyone thinks this card is nuts. A 4-mana 4/4 flyer. A lot of people say that 4-mana 4/4 flyers don't have the best history, but that's not necessarily true in the recent environments, right? I mean, Phoenix, Rekindling Phoenix was a 4/3 flyer. It saw tons of play. Sphinx of Foresight, 4/4 flyer, saw tons of play. Thunderbreak Regent saw a good amount of play back in the day, just a few sets ago. So 4/4 flyers don't have the worst track record in the world, especially when they do something cool, and this certainly does. In case you somehow haven't seen this, it's the card everyone's talking about. But in case you haven't seen it, it's 4 mana, 2 red for a 4/4 dragon with flying. You don't lose unspent red mana as steps and phases end, and when Tyrant dies, you may pay any amount of red. When you do, it deals that much damage to any target. So you can just stockpile red, basically, and end up dealing a whole bunch of damage when this dies. So within a couple of turns, it becomes a must kill, and if your opponent does kill it, they're still going to take like 8 damage. Like, it's ridiculous. This is effectively kind of a ramp tool in some ways. And I just think there's so many ridiculous things about this card. I think anyone saying that the card is bad is just outright wrong. I will say, I'll temper that with saying we don't know if the card's going to see standard play. That is true of every card we've seen so far. There have been some slam dunks for standard playability, and I think this is up there in that category, especially when we've got stuff like Ironcracked Feet in the format. You know, play Ironcracked Feet, then play this, and permanently stock 3 mana. Seems decent to me, so I like that. And there's a bunch of other stuff you can do with this. It's an amazing top deck, right? If you get it on turn 8 or whatever, then you just play it for 4, and you pump all your other mana into it at the end of your opponent's turn or something like that. Or if your opponent does try to kill it, then you can just immediately tap all your mana that you have left over. And it's going to cost them, 4 life to kill this thing. It seems really, really good to me. And yeah, it dies to removal, but not without a fight. So I'm a big fan of this, and I think it probably is going to see some amount of standard play because it looks like there are a couple of decks that specifically want a card like this. I also haven't talked about Turn Timber Symbiosis here on the channel yet. This is 7 mana, 4 and 3 green for a sorcery. Look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may put a creature card from among them onto the battlefield. If that card has converted mana cost 3 or less, it enters with 3 additional +1/+1 counters on it. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And of course, the other side of this is a land that can enter untapped if you bolt yourself and it taps for green. Unbelievable. Just a really good card. It may not be the best of the cycle. I think the best of the cycle is probably the red one, but this is so far maybe the second or third best of the cycle. I really like this card. It's not hard to get to 7 mana in this format. We do have Cultivate, we have Euro, we have other ramp cards that we have access to. So it's not too hard to get to this if you want to. 7 mana is a lot less in green than it is in the other colors, is the point I'm trying to make. So it's not unfeasible to cast this like it is some of the other spells. Or at least you can make the argument that it is with some of the other spells. You'll cast this one much earlier than you will some of the others, so it's an unbelievable card, and if you do nab a small creature off of it, then it makes that creature big for you, so there's just no bad creature. There's no bad thing to get off of this, and 7 cards is an enormous dig. It's a huge dig. It puts the creature right onto the table, too, and if you do get something that costs 3 mana, like a Yorvo, a Lovestruck Beast, then it makes the Yorvo a 7/7, makes the Lovestruck Beast an 8/8, right? It's just, it's so crazy, but it can also grab a Kogla, or it can grab that new Carnage Tyrant thing that costs 7 mana. It's nuts, man. Like, the card looks great to me. It's a beautiful top deck later in the game, and it's a beautiful top deck on like turn 5 if you have the mana to cast it. So I love this card. I think it is easily one of the best of this land cycle, and it's destined to see lots of play. But I'll move on to a card that you might not expect to see me talk about. In this list of stuff that I missed from the weekend. It's Concerted Defense. This is just 1 blue mana for an instant. Counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 1, plus an additional 1 for each creature in your party. So if this was just counter target spell unless they pay 1 for each creature in your party, that would be terrible. I would not necessarily like this spell, but it's 1 plus 1. So you're always going to be able to like force spike a non-creature spell for 1 mana, right? 1 mana, they have to pay 1, no matter what's in your party. And that's actually a big deal. I could see this even without people in your party, countering an Ugin in the late game, because most people use all their mana to cast Ugin. Or just, if people are trying to cast a 4 or a 5 drop on curve, this will pretty much always counter it, like 90% of the time. They go for Questing Beast on turn 3, Well, not questing beasts. I shouldn't say creatures. It's non-creatures, but you know what I'm trying to say. Just a lot of things that people are trying to do on curve. You know, they try to cast a planeswalker on curve. Then this is going to counter it even if you don't have creatures in your party. I just really like 1 mana spells that counter stuff. Even if it's a very conditional spell like this, 1 mana to counter a spell is something you always have to look at. And if you have even 1 creature in your party, the spell becomes kind of bananas. And it's not hard. You know, you get a rogue on turn 1 in various ways in this format. So by turn 2, this just becomes kind of unbelievable. So I would really look out for this card. Again, any counter spells that cost 1 mana are always worth a look. But this one especially looks very good and is not too hard to get a creature or 2 in your party. Once you have 1 creature in your party, this is just a crazy card. So let's move on here to Scourge of the Skyclaves. This is 2 mana, 1 and a black for a star demon with kicker 4 and a black. When you cast this spell, if it was kicked, each player loses half their life, rounded up. Scourge of the Skyclave's power and toughness are each equal to 20 minus the highest life total among players. So this definitely goes in one of those Suicide Black decks, and I hope that Suicide Black is like a thing again at some point. Also, I hope I don't get demonetized for saying the name of that deck. But in any case, we used to call it that. It's just a black deck that often does a lot of damage to itself, but it does damage to its opponent at a faster rate. So these are usually really low-to-the-ground aggro decks that play, you know, effects that make them lose life and whatnot. And this could easily go in one of those, but if you want to play it on curve, it's probably not going to be very good. You know, there are situations where you can maybe bolt yourself with a land. Sucks we don't have shock lands to do that anymore in Standard, but in Historic we do, so keep that in mind. But like in Standard, you can bolt yourself with one of these untapped lands. And then on the next turn, you know, play a 1-drop. Next turn, you swing with your 1-drop, and you can actually safely play this, and it won't be a 0/0. So that's kind of interesting. But I think this goes better on like turn 4 or turn 5, where you can effectively double spell. You know, on turn 4, you can play a 2-drop that kills one of their guys. It's already done damage to you. It kills one of their guys. You can get in with some of your guys, and then second main phase, you play this. And at that point, it's going to have some power and toughness, very likely. So there are spots in the game where I like this. And obviously, as a top deck in the relative late game, it's good whether or not you kick it most of the time. So I do like this card, but I'm a little wary of just jamming 4 copies. But I will move on to not the last card of the day. I'll show my face for the last card of the day. I'm just very self-conscious about my teeth because I broke one of my teeth. So I didn't want to spend all the time on camera today. But I will come back to talk about the last card. But the next to last card I want to talk about, and the last card I want to talk about in this section of the video, is Salidas Vision. I actually think this might be one of the best cards in the set. This is 2 and a blue for an instant. Look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal an instant or sorcery card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest into the bottom of your library in a random order. And obviously the other side is a land that taps for blue and enters tapped. This is crazy to me. This is really, really good. Now, first of all, on turn 3, a lot of control decks are going to be looking for that Shatter the Sky for the next turn. This gives you a 6-card dig. You know, a lot of times you play Narset on turn 3, dig for that Shatter the Sky for turn 4. This goes deeper. This goes 50% deeper than Narset. And yeah, you only get to do it one time. See, it's hard to compare it to cards like Narset or Search for Wisconsin, but those are the first cards I think of. Obviously, those cards could find Planeswalkers, both Narset and Search for Wisconsin. Whereas this can't. This can only find instants or sorceries. But again, if what you're digging for is another card advantage piece, or you're digging for a spot removal spell, or most likely a sweeper like Shatter for turn 4, then this is exactly what you want. And I just don't see a world where control decks don't play at least 2 of this, if not the full 4. It just looks unbelievable to me, right? If you need a land drop so that you can play that Shatter on turn 4, then this is your turn 3 land drop. But then again, that's if you already have the Shatter. But if you haven't found the Shatter yet, boom. Instant speed, EOT, dig 6. A 6-card dig is just so big. It's so big, and this is very likely not going to find like win conditions for you unless there's some sort of commence the end game like card in this environment. You know, it's not going to find like Shark Typhoons. It won't find Planeswalkers, so that's kind of a downside to the card. But at the same time, it's going to find really important stuff pretty much every time you play the card. If you do whiff on it, that's going to feel really very bad. I'll admit that. But 6 cards is enough to make me think that if you have, you know, like 24 instants or sorceries, 20 instants or sorceries in your deck, the chance that you whiff is actually insanely low. So I really don't see how this isn't like one of the better cards in the set for a very specific deck. Again, you very likely have to be playing blue-white or blue-black control here. And again, you have to be playing probably 20 plus instants and sorceries to make absolutely sure you never whiff on this. But that said, in those decks, this is an all-star card that makes sure you either hit your drops or get your important spells like sweepers and whatnot before it's too late. So just a huge fan of this. And again, it's probably one of my favorite cards from the set so far. But oh boy, we got brand new cards as of right now, everybody. I apologize if the audio is slightly different. I have moved locations. I moved over to my editing chair, and suddenly there are new cards, and they're actually very impactful. So let's look at Slop Swarm right here. This is 3 mana, 2 and a green for a 1/1 insect with landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 green insect creature token. If you control 6 or more lands, create a token that's a copy of Slop Swarm instead. So after you get your 6 land, you'll start creating copies, which then create more copies, which then exponentially create more copies, and that is crazy. I cannot wait to play with this card. It's a 3 mana 1/1. That's not good. But, on turn 4, you could play this and then play a land, go ahead and get another token, which still isn't amazing, but after your 6th land, this is unbelievable. Like, I cannot wait to try and play with this, especially considering it's very easy to just put lands into play. Something you do a lot in Magic. But let's also look at definitely a better card, all things considered, and that's Kadandu Mammoth. 2 and a green for an elephant that's a 3/3. It has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, Mammoth gets +2/+2 until end of turn. The other side of it is Kadandu Valley, a land that enters tapped and adds green. This is very good. This is super good. There's a 3 mana 3/3, which is fine stats on its own, I guess. It's not the best, but it's fine stats. And every time you play a land, it becomes a 5/5. So, you have kind of a Love-Struck Beastie kind of card, a 3 mana 5/5 on most turns, or at least the next couple of turns after you play it. That also doubles as a land. That's really good. There are going to be some times where you have a Mammoth out and you have another one of these in your hand and you end up playing it as the land because you'd rather swing for 5 that turn than play another 3/3. You can't do anything with that turn. So a lot of interesting flexibility on a card like this, and just basically an overstated creature, or at the very least a creature that's exactly on curve. That's also a land on the other side. That is good. That is a very playable Magic card, considering most of the design philosophy for these have been to, a card that's bad on both sides. A land that comes into play tapped on one side, and then a very under-curve or below rate card on one side. But in this case, you get, a bad land that you'll take when you need the land drop, or when you need to, trigger landfall, you'll take that. But on the other side, you get a card that's actually kind of decent just on its own. So this card's going to see play. The landfall deck especially is going to play 4 copies of this, whether or not it's, green-white, red-green, or even Naya. Guaranteed to play all 4 copies of this card. But I'm finally back. Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm here to talk about my favorite card from the day, and this might actually be my favorite card from the set. I don't want it to be. I very much don't want this to be my favorite card from the set, but I am also hopeless, completely hopeless. So let's look at Maddening Cacophony real quick. God, this card. It's 1 and a blue for a sorcery with kicker 3 and a blue. Each opponent mills 8 cards, but if you kicked it instead, each opponent mills half their library. Rounded up. That's only 6 mana, by the way, which, is kind of a lot for your, whatever, you're traumatized, I guess. But at least you can say that traumatized is in standard, so that's that's pretty good. And it's not too hard to get to 6 mana for what that's worth. But even if you're just paying 2 mana for this, which I think you will most of the time, pretty good. You're almost casting Glimpse the Unthinkable. And you don't even have to have black in your deck, but I think a lot of the mill decks probably will have black in them. Although it looks like a lot of the mill decks on Standard 2021 on Arena are blue and red, and they play Blitz the Thunder Raptor and stuff. It's an interesting list, but we'll see. These decks might trend more towards blue and black so they can play either Rogues or Drown in the Loch or something like that. But either way, no matter what mill deck you're currently playing, this is definitely going in as a 4 of, because 8 cards is a lot. Now, I know this doesn't affect the battlefield, it doesn't affect the game state or the board, but, all the things that you say about mill cards, all that. It's a sorcery, so you can't just, hold it up and then cast it EOT or something. And that kind of sucks. So, there's negative things about the card, but it's still it's half Glimpse the Unthinkable, half Traumatized. I will never not be excited about that. The card looks insane. And honestly, the mill decks are losing Drowned Secrets, right? Which is one of the best tools that the mill decks have right now. And I think, though, that this is an amazing replacement for Drowned Secrets any day of the week. Really excited to get my hands on this. This, along with Ruin Crab and Teferi's Tutelage, is probably just going to tear apart libraries in the upcoming formats. So I cannot wait to play this card. But that's all we got for today, y'all. We're going to finish things off tomorrow afternoon. I'm pretty sure there's going to be some sort of dump to finish the set off, but there are a few rares and mythics that we haven't quite seen yet. But that said, make sure that you subscribe to the channel because we're going to have top 10 videos, sleepers, top 25 cards in the set as well. And then deck techs, and I'm really excited to brew in this season. I think that so far this set is bringing some really interesting wrinkles. And it might not just be like Euro Standard. It might be Euro Standard. It might be Mono Red Standard. But one way or the other, I'm interested to brew in this Standard because I think this set brings a lot of like really cool new stuff to play with. So I'm kind of juiced about this set. I know a lot of people aren't like super happy about the power level, but I'm kind of happy that the power level seems to be dipping a little bit. I think Magic Standard in general needed that to some extent. So you covering up the mic, bud? Hey, buddy. Hey, buddy, you have a seat. Have a seat, sir. Anyway, aside from that, I guess make sure that you hit up the Patreon, link in the description. Or just go to patreon.com/SBMTG. If you give $1 a month, you can vote on what decks we do first this season and affect the course of YouTube history, in fact. So get in there. The Patreon really helps me out. And aside from that, I'm sorry I didn't show my face much in this video. I'm actually missing a tooth like right here. In case you didn't know, I broke this tooth the other night. And I have a dentist appointment later on in the week. But I have to do these videos. Because I have to do spoilers, y'all. And I was really excited to get back on camera after my AC was broken and now it's fixed. So I just really missed y'all. I wanted to see you again. Anyway, that's all I got for this one. Just do all the stuff, YouTube things, and I will catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.